Well, hello, everyone. It's John Lockland here. I'm the director of FVD International, Forum for Democracy International. My co-host Peter Lavelle and I am delighted to welcome as our main guest this week former Royal Navy officer Commodore Steve Jermy, who has worked, apart from in the Royal Navy, in the British Ministry of Defence, and was also, as I understand it, number 2 to the Chiefs of Staff of the British Armed Forces. And Steve is, we hope, going to be joined later on by Jacques, Colonel Jacques Hogard, formerly of the French Army, to discuss the proposed Franco-British deployment to Ukraine, which we heard a lot about at the Paris and London summits. There have been several of these, both at political level and at top military level. And it seems as if the plan, or at least according to the British Prime Minister anyway, the plan is in its operational stage. In other words, that they are getting ready to go to send, we believe, a fairly large number of troops into Ukraine. Let's go to you, Steve. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you on. Peter Lavelle and I have discussed the Ukraine war and indeed the whole issue of Ukraine on many occasions over the years. And I think we know the political side pretty much inside out. And we've certainly been of the view that Russia is winning. And I wonder if, before we discuss the deployment, the possible deployment of French and British troops, Steve, you could let us know what do you think NATO, as after all the Ukraine war is a proxy war between NATO and Russia, fought in the theater of Ukraine. What do you think we have learned? What has NATO learned, or what have observers like you learned about the kind of warfare that is being currently conducted? NATO having, as I don't need to tell you, conducted air campaigns in Kosovo and Libya, but not ground ones, a counterinsurgency operation which ultimately failed in Afghanistan. But NATO hasn't ever fought, as far as I'm aware, a proper ground war of the kind that is going on at the moment. What's your view, Steve, about what we've learnt in military terms, military, strategic and tactical terms from the Ukraine war? Steve Jermy.
No, thank you, John, and thank you for the invitation to talk with both you and Peter. I think there are probably a number of lessons, and if I come from the sort of the strategic downwards, I mean, the first thing I think that NATO have learned is that it's difficult to coordinate across all of the NATO nations and achieve a coordinated form of support, even if the war was a good idea, which I don't think it was. I think the other strategic thing, which is the much more important thing, is that NATO has been pursuing a strategy which it describes as collective security, but in truth, it's been one of confrontational security. And what we've seen is a move from the west to the east as NATO expands. Now, there are many who I tend to term the expansionists who will say, well, that's fine, NATO can do what it likes. I think that view is wrong, and I think it's been proved wrong because Russia has been warning us from as far back as 1990 or as far back as the 2008 Bucharest summit that expansion would cross a red line for them. What's also interesting is quite a few really clever Western strategic thinkers, starting with George Kennan back in 1996, have been making these same warnings. And I think what this has proved is that they were right and the expansionists were wrong. And I think anybody who thinks this war was anything to do with other than NATO expansion doesn't understand history. I can focus then, John, if you'd like, and go down a level and start to look at the operational side.
Yes, please, because we know about hypersonic missiles, we know about drones, we know about shell production. How does this all fit together? And is it a war of attrition? Is it a war of territorial conquest? How do we understand this war in military terms?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I would say that the first thing, and I have said this on previous podcasts with other people, is that Russia has been acting, in my view, according to a military strategy, whereas NATO has been acting according to a political narrative. And that's a poor way to actually design your operations. So the strategy, as far as I can see, was now into what I would guess is about phase 3. Of course, I don't know. and nobody does, and everybody who keeps talking about they know what Putin's going to do next must be mind readers, in my view. I can surmise, though, on my basis of strategic analysis. I said before we started to you that I wrote a book on strategy. It's not a plug for the book because it's out of print, but it's called Strategy for Action Using Force Wisely in the 21st Century. And I wrote it, John and Peter, because I realized that we're very bad at strategy in the West. And when my evidence is clear, we've now had Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Syria, and Ukraine. And it seems to me that we're looking at the face of 5 separate defeats there. Yeah. So strategy matters. My sense in the original phase was that at the start of the special military operation, and I should preface this by saying that I did not see it coming, but I was quick to look at it through the lens of the perspectives that I've learned through the book. It seemed to me that this was one of political pressure, seeking to put political pressure on Kiev, and to actually perhaps to show to the West that when Russia said this was a red line, it really was a red line. I think that what we saw is sort of 2 prongs: a pronged attack into the Donbass, which arguably was in support of the separatists within the Donbass, who had been under attack, according to the OSCE, since the Minsk agreements, to the extent of 14,000 killed. Where the other attack was into Kiev, and that was seeking to put pressure into Kiev. Now, of course, we were close to signature until Boris Johnson went across and, in my mind, foolishly persuaded the Ukrainians not to take the deal. And I think when it then became clear to the Russians that they were going to have to fight, then what we saw was something of what I would call a strategic withdrawal. It was seen as defeat by the Russians. I don't believe that. I think it was a strategic withdrawal to the Sorodnev line, which was constructed by one of Russia's great defensive generals. In fact, I think
the whole strategy almost worked. Go up to Kiev,
get
the negotiations starting, get a signature, and go home. That's what the strategy was.
Yeah, and the interesting thing on this, Peter, is that every time that the West and Ukraine have been offered an opportunity for a deal, conditions, that each time that they refused it, then next time that the possibility comes up, then what they're offered is less. Yeah. Because, of course, Russia is making further progress west. So I think what then the second phase is strategic withdrawal to the line. And then what we see is Russia starting to build up its forces, starting to mobilize, whilst at the same time, the Ukrainians very foolishly, I think, start to attack this line. And from the sound of the New York Times article, under the guidance of American generals, and lose not one, but at least 2 and arguably 3 armies for no penetration of that line. It's a terrible piece of generalship, I'm afraid.
Are you referring, Steve, there to the 2020
both
counteroffensive, or to the Kursk operation?
The counteroffensives. I'll talk about the Kursk operation as well, but I'm talking to the counteroffensives.
Yeah. And
in many ways, if you think back to what the objectives are, and Russia has been clear about its objectives, one of those was demilitarization. So in a way, the Ukrainians were actually helping the Russians with their objective by throwing an army against an impenetrable line. I mean, it's almost... it's tragic. I genuinely mean that. It's a tragic situation. Yeah. And then what we start...
I've always objected to the war of attrition argument, because, just as John was saying, this is not about territory. The line doesn't have to move really at all, as long as Ukraine's military is grounded down. And that's the objective. It's not to take territory. It is to destroy their ability to conduct any kind of offensive operations, even with NATO's help. So this whole narrative of, it's a war of attrition, neither side is winning. No, one side is wearing down the other one pretty significantly. And that's the whole point. That is the strategy.
Yeah, I mean, when people talk about war of attrition, there are 2 very defined, there are 2 very times between wars of maneuver and wars of attrition. And this was strong in the Western doctrine throughout the Cold War. The war of maneuver was the sort of war of maneuver that was employed by the Germans in 1940 to cross the Meuse and move at such speed that they psychologically defeated the French in many ways.
Yes.
But you're right, Peter. The war of attrition is a war where on one side is wearing down the other side, and you don't need to seize territory for a war of attrition. If you don't have to seize territory, then so much the better. And I think what we've seen is that war of attrition, but we're also now seeing slow accretion of, so I say slow, it's increasing in speed, but land being captured by the Russians in a very deliberate way. And I think it's now 30 months since the Russians have been seizing territory for the last 30 months. I don't think they need to go quickly. And of course, what the West is used to is the sorts of things that happen in Desert Storm, where our forces are moving at speed, large armored forces at speed. But again, if your objective is to demilitarize, then one of the ways to do that is destroying the forces of the other country. So that seems to me to have been.
And on top of that, the Russian authorities have no intention whatsoever of ruling over a majority Ukrainian population. They are not interested in that. There would be no benefit whatsoever. And so let them come to us. And that's the mentality. I mean, Kursk is kind of embarrassing as it was actually kind of a very bizarre gift, because you want to get even closer so we can take out some of your best people. Again, I mean, there was, politically, the narrative, Ukraine's only 300 kilometers from Moscow. It's almost over. But where I live in Moscow. I said, this is extraordinary. You want to come to be around the dust? Okay.
When I first looked at this war, Peter, I had a sort of good look at it, and I'd written an article for our Naval Review in September 2022. I forecast that the Russians would win. I forecast that there would be significant economic consequences for the Europeans, because I forecast that the sanctions would in effect be boomerang sanctions, as indeed they have been. But I also forecast that I felt that the Russians, looking on the ground, subject to how negotiations would go, would move west until they got to around about the Dnieper. And it felt to me that was a very solid strategic defensive line. And then the question that remains in my mind is Odessa. And I think a stretch target would be Odessa. But to come to the nature of the war at the operational level, I think what we have seen on both sides is significant changes. And the change that we've seen is in the use of drones, of course, and that makes the war feel almost like a maritime war, but at smaller scale, because we're doing things that were very difficult to do on land. But what that has meant, and this is why I find the Western casualty figures so bizarre, what it has meant that there has been much better targeted artillery. Now, artillery is the big killer in war, and certainly in the First World War, it's responsible for by far the most deaths. Now, if that artillery is now operating with extremely good coordinates and extremely quickly, then you wear people down more quickly. And at the moment, people are saying on the one hand that the Russians have lost 1 million and the Ukrainians about 45,000, but on the other hand, that Ukraine's running out of ammunition. So how can it be that the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition and yet the Russians are suffering 10 times as many casualties? It makes no sense whatsoever. So to me, it's the other way around.
If I could just chime in here, social media is very vibrant here, extremely vibrant. All these Telegram channels, and I've told John and our other guests, I take it all kind of at face value. Okay, well, that's what you claim, that's what you say, and I just keep strolling. But if there were 1 million casualties, there would be a social uproar, because as I've explained to others, is that there's no war fever in Russia. Everybody wants it over. They don't want, they're not, we need victory. We need to show them. No, that kind of language doesn't exist. Now, the Azov people, right sector, yes, they should be put on trial for crimes that they have committed. But, no summary executions and stuff like that. There's no vengeance here. There's just this desire to have it come to an end. Okay. I would seriously doubt if there really, when it comes, there'll be victory parades, because that's not the sentiment, people. That's not the sentiment here.
Yeah, I mean, that makes very, very good sense to me, Peter. I think, ironically, if you would, certainly it seems to be the case amongst the population in America, that there's very much that same sense. I think that's one of the reasons why Trump's, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why Trump was so dominating in the most recent American elections. And I think amongst the body of the Europeans, there's a similar sense as well. When I was in the Afghan war, I was in Afghanistan in 2007. I think it was fair to say that the British population, and I speak only on that war, the British population got to the conclusion that they didn't really understand where the war was going, and they got there a fair bit quicker than the politicians and the sort of strategic people. And I sense that's happening here, although I can't be sure. But to head on to the Kursk operation, and this seemed to me very misguided. And it seemed to me misguided, yet, as you say, cited in the West, and again, it fit the political narrative, not the military strategy. It fit the political narrative that actually this is a war of attrition and that both sides were wearing each other down. But I remember thinking at the time, indeed, I said to Daniel Davis, I think this looks to me like another opportunity for the Russians, in as much as the Kursk salient, as I call it, was into area which is fairly unpopulated, and it was fairly soon that the neck of the salient was starting to tighten a bit. But my sense was that the Russians weren't seeking to cut off the neck, which I'm almost certain they could have done militarily, but instead wait for the Ukrainians to throw more brigades into it, and therefore provide a cauldron, as I said before. One of the things to bear in mind in this war, of course, is that actually fairly early on, Russia achieved air superiority, which makes things very, very difficult. I mean, down in the Falklands War, which I was involved, the critical element for us was the maintenance of air superiority, which we did. But having that air superiority means it's very, very, very difficult. And that salient reminded me of what was known as the Falaise Gap in Normandy, where the Germans were caught. I think a German army, or perhaps a couple of corps, were caught in a gap with no air power, and they were slaughtered, frankly. And I think the same thing, I suspect, has happened in the Kursk salient. The idea of it drawing away Russian forces, I think there's no need for it to draw away Russian forces, because they seem to me to be significantly in excess of Ukrainian forces, and able to replenish for units to come out of the line and then come back in, which the Ukrainians just don't have the capacity to do.
But the issue of air superiority does indeed bring us back to NATO, doesn't it? Because as I understand it, most of its previous wars, obviously Kosovo and Libya, perhaps Afghanistan to a lesser extent, not Syria, but they were based on, they were purely air wars. Kosovo and Libya were purely air wars. There was no ground element at all. And so you said right at the beginning, Steve, and I very much certainly rang very true. I strongly agree with it, that it was a war based not on strategy, but on narratives, on political narratives. And that, by the way, of course, was true of the Kursk operation, which I think it was Borrell, the former EU High Representative, admittedly not a military figure, but nonetheless a political figure, who said that the Kursk intervention had destroyed Putin's narrative, which seemed to me to prove that it was intended to change the narrative rather than to actually achieve any military goals. But what is the weakness, if it is weakness, of NATO? Is it that we threw a lot of kit at the Ukrainians, more or less pell-mell, without it being coordinated? A lot of it, I think, old kit. Was it that, as the New York Times says, the Americans were planning away like mad and controlling everything, but the Ukrainians didn't do what they said? Was it that Russia produces more shells and has more men? Where do we situate the weakness? Is it on all of these levels, or is
and also how could that? This is something. And I'm not a military person, but I never could make any sense. Russia has an integrated military. It creates its own ordnance. Everything about its military is Russian, okay? Yeah. And everybody knows what to do when. And I could never understand all of this kit, as John said, being thrown into Ukraine. How do you coordinate all of that? Okay, this is and plus so much of the equipment, there was a lack of compatibility, and then you have different military doctrines. I mean, should we be surprised that where we are right now?
No, not the slightest. I mean, I'm not the slightest bit surprised. I mean, to answer your questions and picking up your points, Peter, the fundamental point, and is in the writing of General André Beaufray, I'm sorry, who's a French general who was writing who I studied when I was writing my book. He wrote in 1963 that in war, the loser deserves to lose because his defeat will be a result of failures in thinking either before or during the war. Now, the failure in thinking this one was before the war, because if we'd thought it through, we'd have never done it in the first place. That was the failure in thinking. And it's clear as well that we didn't think it through, because when the special military operation kicked off, nobody in NATO was ready.
Yeah.
So that's the first failure in thinking. When it comes to NATO itself, I wrote recently, Peter, I think you're aware, in Responsible Statecraft, an article in which I expose the critical weaknesses in NATO, because there is this general part of the political narrative that NATO is the greatest alliance ever, and it's pure fantasy. I mean, the great alliance, I think, ironically, was during the Second World War between the British, the Americans, the Russians, the British Commonwealth, and the Chinese. And that was the greatest alliance by some way. NATO has 5 problems that I highlighted. The first is that we are not mobilized for a war. And it's not just militarily mobilized, it's industrially mobilized as well. And we've seen that because Russia very quickly is out producing the whole of NATO on 155 millimeter shells. The second is that for NATO to have had any chance of success, and this is a theoretical analysis, Peter, for us to have any chance of success, you would have to deploy in a large-scale war in which the whole of NATO was involved. We'd have to deploy across the Atlantic American troops.
Yes.
Now, at the moment,
that's just the point. I mean, what is NATO? Because if the United States is not leading and cajoling and blackmailing, and then what is it? Okay, because I want to ask you, and I guess it's connected now. I mean, an Anglo-French maybe expedition force before there's a ceasefire, before the end of the war, after the war. What does that mean in the context of NATO? And what does that mean in the context if the Trump administration doesn't want to get involved? Should we even be using the term NATO anymore?
I think we probably shouldn't. I think that because as soon as, I mean, NATO has its famous Article 5, which is an attack on one is to be treated as an attack on all, but that doesn't mean to say that everybody actually gets involved. I think what we've seen is that NATO is, from experience, was an effective organization up to the end of the Cold War, but then thereafter has rather lost its strength. I mean, part of the mobilization problem is that we're not spending as much. So at the end of the Cold War, we were spending in Britain between 5 and 6% of GDP on defense, and we're now struggling to get to 2.5% of our GDP. So the idea that we can mobilize quickly is impossible. But there is also, NATO is a complex organization, like all big organizations, all big supranational entities, such as the EU. Decision making is very, very difficult. Each decision has to be taken back to each of the individual members. So what we're really seeing is that forces or countries which are part of NATO are actually involved in the war. But I'm starting to see this no longer as a NATO operation, not least of all because of the clarity with which Pete Hegseth talked about the operation early on. I mean, I can't remember it exactly, but he said there will be no Article 5, so there'll be no deployment of American troops, no backstop, and no NATO operation. So essentially, he's actually undermined NATO. In my view, NATO is one of the primary reasons for the war. I've said in that article that NATO exists to confront the threat created by its continued existence, but doesn't have the capacity to defeat that threat that the existence creates. So I think one of the big opportunities for the Americans, interestingly, is to have a conversation with the Russians about NATO. Because if NATO were to be no longer or to be demobilized and parts of it transferred into the OSCE, of which Russia is a member, then I could imagine that might be something which the Russians would take. I don't think Trump has any cards in his discussion with Putin, but he does have cards in his discussions with Ukraine.
Yeah, I just don't think he and his people are thinking that big, and I think that's really
not yet. Yeah,
that's what's most because I mean, 2 points. Pete Hegg said, by the way, he has a brand new anti-Muslim tattoo.
Yes.
The same guy that said there will be no Article 5. I mean, if you're the British and the French, why don't you just take the win? Well, the Americans don't want to do it. We have to, we have to change strategy. Okay. I mean, for me, that's a way out. I mean, it wasn't our fault. We did everything we could, but that's one way out. And again, what we just mentioned here, there's a win-win situation for everyone, even to some degree Ukraine, because Ukraine would continue as an ongoing concern, is just think big and then go small. Because what we're doing now, the grain deal, no bombing of energy facilities, that's small. Go big and you can solve all of those problems. The Russians want that. That's what they really want. And they've said it over and over again, but no one hears in the West.
I think one of the problems in the West, again, I come back to this distinction between the Russians acting according to military strategy and the West according to a political narrative. Now, the problem with the political narrative is that, to me, it's fanciful. It's the worst way to actually drive operations. But I'm afraid to say that very many of the European elites actually believe the narrative. So ingrained has it become that it becomes very difficult to break them out of it, notwithstanding the facts on the ground and the realities on the ground. So, the narrative is that Zelensky is a Chechenian hero and that Putin is a Hitlerian villain. And it's such a binary and sort of short-sighted narrative. And I took the time early on in the war to actually read, to listen to Oliver Stone's interviews with Putin, and also to read a very good biography on Putin. Both very balanced, and neither, they weren't sort of Putin-esque treatments, but they've got to understand the man a little bit more. And he strikes me in many things as extremely strategic. As a man with an extremely strategic mind, and also quite cautious as well. So I think this is what this, and the deduction of that analysis was that this is a person who deserved military respect, because actually I think that the strategy that he's been pursuing is showing to be successful. I say, go ahead.
Yeah, go on. Sorry. No, I was going to say, if it's true that as I'm convinced it is, that the European elites are still in hock to their narrative, then that implies that Starmer and Macron will indeed send troops into Ukraine. And how do you see that playing out, Steve?
Yeah, well, as you and I have discussed, John, I work for local government, or work for a company that's closely associated with local government. So what I won't do, and it would be wrong for me to do, is to comment specifically on either British government policy, but also for reasons of courtesy on French government policy as well.
Fair enough.
But if you were to ask me what my view would be on the deployment of those forces as a military man, were I the Chief of Defence Staff, that won't happen, but were I to be so, I would be extremely cautious, because I would be looking at the military session on the ground and working out how the Russians have been fighting. And I would know very well that the Russians have made very clear warnings that actually any Western troops, NATO troops deployed into Ukraine will be seen as fighting on the side of Ukraine. And I would expect those troops to be attacked. And I give it a sort of 50-50, but perhaps even 40-60 in favor of an attack, I'm afraid to say. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is that I've seen one or two reports talking about the troops being deployed so that they can release Ukrainians to move forward to the front line.
Yes.
If that were to be the case, the assumption there is that those troops are not vulnerable if they're further behind the front line. I'm afraid it isn't true. One of my jobs in the Navy was to command an air defence destroyer. So I know a fair bit about air defense. And what I can tell you is that the ballistic missiles that Russians have in their armory, we do not have defenses against them. And we certainly don't have defenses against the hypersonic missiles. Yeah. And I doubt that we'll at best, we would create those sorts of military defenses against such missiles in 10 years.
But Steve, if going with the contingency that British and French troops could be sent to Ukraine as a military force under their own flag, doesn't that open up France and the UK to be targets of Russian military?
Yeah, I think
it's wearing very thin here. Yeah. I have to tell you, gentlemen, is that Americans are giving Ukrainians weapons to kill Russians in internationally recognized Russian territory. It can't go on much longer because public opinion here is saying this is inherently unfair. They're hitting our homeland. They've broken every single promise since the end of the Cold War, and now they're taking out our villages. That cannot stand, gentlemen. And there's going to be an enormous amount of pressure to send a message, because that is, we're not a party to the conflict. We're not a combatant. Well, that changes. That changes a lot. And public opinion does count here.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that people say here is that, well, it's not fair. The Ukrainians aren't, Russia's got this great big hinterland, and the Ukrainians don't. But my view is, well, actually they do, really, because actually their factories and their training facilities, a lot of it has been outside in NATO countries. So, of course, they have been protected in that way. When was a lot of talk about extending Russian missile attacks into Russia, which I thought was a very bad idea, an extremely risky idea. It made me really concerned. Then one of the things that I wondered whether the Russians might do, I suspected they wouldn't, but I wondered whether they might, was to actually do what you said, Peter, and extend the conflict into attacking British and French and American facilities. A good example might be somewhere like Cyprus. I suspected that they wouldn't, but I would have been nervous in those places, and I'd be nervous in places that produced Storm Shadow missiles and so on. So I think that my guess is, Peter, that they won't, but my guess is that they certainly would attack Western troops in Russia, in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, yeah.
But a caveat that's going on in the background here, and that's one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, is that, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but the Trump administration's overtures to normalize relations with Moscow, they mistakenly, I think, believe that is a way to resolve the Ukraine problem. And that's not going to cut, that doesn't cut anything here. No, they'd say, what? That doesn't mean anything to it. It doesn't resolve any of our security problems, because the fundamental problem in this whole discussion about the special military operation is about Russia's security interests, which the West denies even exists.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think I would like to think this is a fairly inexperienced American administration early in its time. I would like to think that actually they move reasonably quickly, although when you look at the quality of somebody like Lavrov, who I think is a standout foreign minister, then they've got a lot of catching up to do. I think that the fundamental point, and people talk about a ceasefire, but to me it sort of misses the point, which is that Russia is interested in its long-term security. Now, if the Americans were to come into this discussion with instead of looking at the ceasefire, is looking right out into the distance and saying, and then having a conversation with Russia, what does their long-term security look like? What feature might NATO play in it or not? What feature might the OSCE play in it or not? And what is the fundamental basis for a secure security infrastructure and architecture in Europe? Then that would be a better way to start the conversation, and then work your way back to the ceasefire. Because the war is a symptom. It's not the ultimate thing itself, but it's a symptom of this problem of NATO's confrontation approach to security. And I think that's the way I'd be starting the discussions. I think the problem, of course, is that Trump has said that he wants to move quickly, and I'm very pleased that actually we are actually now in the situation where the Americans are talking to the Russians. I mean, at last, this has been a sort of celebration in the West that diplomacy is not done. And to me, I've said before, it's like celebrating incompetence. Surely in diplomacy you keep talking. Even in the long 36-year war between, or in the war against the IRA, the internal war in Britain, conversations kept going throughout that war. And so I think that actually having those conversations is really important. I think that the Trump doesn't have cards to play against Putin. Putin has the cards as far as I can see, and Putin's options are either, my guess is that he will keep going until he's achieved as much territory as he needs to guarantee what he feels to be Russia's security. But I think Trump does have cards to play, but the cards are in a different conversation. They're in the conversation with the Europeans and the Ukrainians, because Trump is very powerful. He has the cards, and they don't really. So I'd much rather see when the Americans and the Russians have started to get a sense of what it is that the Russians really want, that actually the Trump administration are more hard-nosed with the Europeans, because at the moment, as far as I can see, the Europeans are doing, I'm not sure whether this is consciously, but unconsciously doing almost everything they can to prevent the end of the war and to prolong the casualties.
I think they are doing that consciously, because the end of the war is dangerous. Well, obviously it's dangerous for Zelensky, we know that, but it affords, there's the famous saying in Brussels, never let a good crisis go to waste. It affords the Brussels institutions the ability to raise common debt, to press forward with further European centralization. Emmanuel Macron has an interest in prolonging the war because he's trying to write his job description for his next career move, and also trying to give himself a role now in the remaining couple of years of his presidency, because he is a lame duck at home. He doesn't have a parliamentary majority. And Starmer, I think, Britain, again, I'm not trying to draw you in on this, Steve, but my view is that the British establishment, the Foreign Office, of course, but probably the whole of British government, always thought Brexit was a terrible catastrophe. And this war provides Britain with a way back in, because Britain now becomes, the indispensable component of European security, which, by the way, has been the plan ever since Theresa May in 2017. So unfortunately, I think that they are doing it deliberately, and I haven't even got onto the role of the Balts, that, Kaja Kallas and the defense commissioner, whose name has just escaped me, the former Lithuanian prime minister, they of course play a significant role within Brussels. So I'm afraid I do think it's conscious.
It may be. I wonder if it's the difference between whether it's conspiracy or cock up. It feels to me more the latter than the form, but there may be, and I can't really say one or the other. Whatever it is.
But are they captive of their own narratives? I mean, that I think is the problem. They can't get their head around the fact. See, they're not thinking in terms of the military, because then it would look very, very different. But this is ideological. This is, we can't lose to Russia. Why? Because we can't. You can't have a normal conversation with these people, because one of the things I think is one of the tragedies that we have had since the Second World War, particularly, but specifically since the end of the Cold War, is that we have an ideological view of the world. There's not a geopolitical sensitivity, sensibility when it comes to geopolitics. I mean, when I look at geopolitics, I don't look at regime type. I don't care. Okay, maybe regime type can tell you how they can maybe mobilize better than a democracy, for example. But it's immaterial to me. I mean, security is indivisible, and everybody wants security. So whatever regime type you have, North Korea, I don't care about their regime type, but they want security. Why? Because they have all of these security threats. I mean, that's a dispassionate way of doing it. But the Europeans can't escape their own narratives and their ideological obsessions and possession.
Yeah, I think there's I mean, the problem is we in Europe have been and under the leadership of America as well, have been wandering around the world, intervening in places on so-called humanitarian basis, and we've proven that we're not very good at it. In fact, we're terrible at it. You know, I was in Afghanistan, and I realized actually pretty soon, in Afghanistan, which was at the time I was there, just become a NATO operation. It was astonishing. There was no strategy. And NATO's not good at strategy. You know, there we are. We were 6 years in.
Well, but Steve, I went to the NATO base in Kabul, and it was almost surreal going from the dusty streets of Kabul, seeing almost no women. The only women were all covered up in burqas and all of that. The Afghan soldiers loved American footwear. They were everywhere, and they liked Russian Kalashnikovs. But then when you went into the base, it was like, there's Burger King, there's McDonald's, drinking Dr. Pepper. And I talked to the head of mission, and he said, this is NATO's operation. I said, well, what do the Romanians do? I'm not really sure. What do the Italians do? Not much. And I said, who does the thing here? Oh, we do, the United States. It's an American operation.
But we can see this ideological approach also, by the way, in a largely unrelated area, which is in European Union commercial policy, because everybody knew that Trump was a protectionist, and then he obviously was, clearly headed for the electoral victory last year, and yet Brussels, instead of sorting out the issue of tariffs on cars, for example, and there is an imbalance as it happens. Europe charges 10% on American cars. America charges 2.5% on European cars. Instead of doing anything about it, they simply hunkered down and said, well, we'll carry on as if nothing was happening. We mentioned Dad's Army earlier, and wait for the storm to pass. And in 4 years' time, or even in 2, Trump will be a lame duck. So I think the ideological, what Peter just said now about ideology, blinkering everything and blinding everything, is true across the board.
I think one of the casualties of this war is, and indeed I hope it is a casualty, is NATO. But I also wonder as well and speculate whether one of the other casualties will be the European Union. And the reason I say that is that it seems to me that the damage that has been done I work in the energy sector now, and again, this is so obvious that that imposing the sanctions we were planning to do would have a boomerang effect. The deindustrialization of Germany that seems to be happening because of the tripling of gas prices is going to be catastrophic. And the problem, of course, is that Germany is the beating economic heart of Europe and the beating financial heart of Europe. So Europe, where Germany can no longer afford to bankroll a lot of Europe, and where we then have things like the Target 2 imbalances between the southern states of Europe and the northern states of Europe come to play. It would not surprise me at all if we start to see big fractures in Europe. The other thing that I think I'm starting to see as well is a difference in opinion and views, depending on how close you are to the Russian border. I'm starting to see the Baltic states being a little bit more cautious and with what they're doing with their Russian populations. I mean, the states that are the most forward-leaning in wanting to do something are the ones that are farthest away from Russia, France and Britain, whereas the states that are thinking a lot more about it are those that are closer. We already know what Hungary's position is. Poland,
Stephen, you mentioned the Baltics. I think it was Lithuania this week passed legislation disenfranchising all Russians. I mean, that is just, I don't know. That's a population that has been under siege since the end of the Soviet Union. And now I think it was Lithuania. Now they're incentivizing these people to become separatists. I mean, what are they doing? Like, that doesn't make any logical sense.
I mean, this is why I would like to see the end of NATO, because I remember thinking back in 1996 that why are we giving security guarantees to the Baltic states? And of course, it was because they were in, or when they came into NATO. But of course, that security, what you assume with the security guarantee, despite the fact that you've got a great power and a superpower in nuclear terms next to you, is that you can do whatever you like. And I think people are starting to see that actually that guarantee isn't necessarily what they thought it was. I mean, I think the Americans want out of NATO, and I think it would be in their interest if they were out of it. I also think it would be in Europe's interest, because we would actually start to be more
apropos
practical about our relationships.
I've been of the mind that as the U.S. disengages from NATO, I don't think it will be abrupt, but I think they'll slowly go their own way. Unfortunately, they have their focus on the Middle East and China, but it would maybe be good for Europe. I'm trying to find a silver lining to this unbelievable tragedy, is that eventually, with all the huff and puff right now, these leaders that are in power, they're going to be gone soon. They're not popular. They're not going to get reelected. They'll play lawfare against their opposition, like in France and Romania. But eventually, I hope that with the Americans saying this transatlantic relationship isn't paying dividends for us anymore, you're going to have to deal with the Russians. And a new, hopefully, generation of European leaders will say, yeah, let's just sit down and talk. What do you want? And, we'll tell you what and I think they'll say, we don't have a problem here. The Russians want to be secure within their borders. They don't want a menacing military alliance that has a dreadful CV, particularly since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah,
that would work. Helsinki 2.0.
Yeah, no, I agree, Peter. I mean, if you look at the NATO since the end of the Cold War, it's been terrible. I mean, Kosovo was, you could say it's a victory. I don't think it was, looking back. I mean, at the time, I was actually in the Adriatic supporting that operation, but not really thinking at the strategic level. But actually, if you look at the logic for going in, I think it was Article 51 or Article 138. It was exactly the same logic that Russia used in protection of people, our responsibility to protect. So there's a hypocrisy there, which NATO intervenes on the one hand, and I think Libya was the same, under the same, and then get complaints when Russia does the same in the Donbass.
Just a small point. There was absolutely no legal basis at all for the. No, I don't believe there was any article anywhere about humanitarian intervention. That was then.
No, but I think it would have needed the UN Security Council resolution, I think, John, which it never got.
No, there wasn't a Security Council resolution.
No, it wasn't exactly.
There was for Libya. Indeed, but that was 2011. That was was more than 10 years afterwards.
And that was one of Russia's biggest mistakes. Russia abstained. A huge strategic mistake.
I wrote in 2011. I wrote in part of a Defence Select Committee, I think it was, and said that the whole operation was a mistake. And I said that one of the problems was that we were actually going there for regime change, although we were pretending that it was responsibility to protect. And I said that would destroy or undermine our relationship. I mean, France, Britain, and America with China and Russia, because we've been going there on a pretext and getting a United Nations Security Council resolution on a pretext. I'm afraid to say I was right.
Obama, Sarkozy, and David Cameron wrote an article in the New York Times in April 2011 saying that they wanted regime change. And then when Gaddafi was killed, Alain Juppé, the French foreign minister, went on the radio the next day to say, NATO has achieved its objectives, which were regime change. So it's absolutely black and white.
We're rapidly running out of time. I'd like to ask you another question. We have the specter of, at least in my mind, Yalta 2.0, which of course historians, that is like a historical aspersion. I don't think so. I mean, it was a conference of victors. Okay. The interesting thing was in Yalta, we had Stalin, we had Churchill, we had Roosevelt. Well, Yalta 2.0 will not have a European at the table, and I think that's something that really bothers Europeans. Okay, because maybe it takes Yalta 2.0 to start setting these things straight. Okay. If it's Trump, Putin, and Xi, I'm willing to entertain it. Okay, I mean, the entire history of geopolitics has all been about security interests and spheres of influence. Western liberalism in the middle of the 20th century said, "We're going to, deal the deck. We're going to start from scratch." No, it's going to come back. It always comes back. I don't care what regime type. If it's a liberal democracy or it's an empire, The same things, same mechanics keep working. We need this type of thing to come about. I would like to see NATO dissolved immediately. I don't think it will happen very quickly, but its relevance has been proven to be of limit. It's actually dangerous right now.
Yeah, I mean, two sort of preliminary comments there, Peter. The first is that, of course, the Yalta was comprised of two democracies and one authoritarian state, and yet we were sort of very comfortable with that. And on the same thing, we've talked about Western liberal values, and yet the West is very happy to talk to a number of states in the Gulf, which are about as authoritarian as you can imagine. So, and they do that. So I think, but the point about the table and the Yalta 2.2 is that this is to do with balance of power, and the two powerful actors in this game are Russia and America. Europe is not a powerful actor. We don't have the military forces. We've got debt to GDP ratios which are very high, so we're lacking in economic power. And although people talk about Russia as a small economy, that's a poor understanding. It's not a small economy. It's also a poor understanding of how the way GDP is measured. So Russia's industrial economy, I recently had a quick look at it, is probably about 5 times the size of Britain's and/or 5 times the size of France's. So in terms of industrial might, then that's important, because I can tell you, when you go to war, the last thing you want to throw at an enemy is synthetic collateralized debt obligations. You want to throw, it doesn't matter how big your financial sector is, it's pretty useless when it comes to fighting wars, and Russia is well configured for that. So I think Yalta 2.0 is really between the two great powers. And I think the sooner that the Europeans can understand that and start swinging behind the Americans to support what will be a complicated ceasefire negotiation, the better, because actually then the war is going to be lost one way or another. So, trying to send European troops into Ukraine is like trying to send a team of 10 people onto the Titanic with a foot pump and ask them to actually stop the vessel from sinking. It's not going to happen. You may as well actually start to work with the Americans, not least of all because the Americans have got, in their view, and in my view as well, a bigger fish to fry, which is to sort out the Middle East. And at the moment, they're not doing that very well. I'm quite worried about what they're doing in the Middle East. But that said, whether you're worried or not, it's very clear that the Middle East is America's higher priority. So the sooner they can bring this war to the close, the better. And by stopping them bringing this war to a close, then the Europeans are acting directly against America's security interests, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. I mean, I just can't really understand it. It's it is what it is. But if these were British and French and German and Danish bodies coming back into those nations, and their funerals and their families standing around the graves, this would be a very different situation. When we went into Iraq, I was commanding our Fleet Air Arm, and we had prepared early for that war. But we lost very early on. We had an aircraft crash in operational circumstances, 7 people killed. I went to 6 of those 7 funerals, and I can tell you it's no fun whatsoever. And I think that it's a very cynical thing for the European states to do, to keep the war going when they know that they won't be losing people, and to ignore the losses that we're seeing mount in Ukraine and indeed in Russia, and then to expect Russia to exceed to European conditions. It's this. I've said this before to Daniel Davis, who you both know well. I said at the moment, the Europeans seem to be in the state where actually they think that as the losing side, they can dictate the conditions of the peace. And that's going to be the first time that that's ever happened in history. And the sooner we can work out and learn that from that and start to accept that this was the 5th and hopefully the final mistake of this century, then we can start to work out how not to do it in the future and stop throwing good money after bad, I'm afraid.
And destroying a lot of young lives.
Yes. It's not only is it throwing a lot of young lives. If you look at the circumstances of the European economies, and I won't talk about ones in particular, but I think apart from Germany, all the G7 countries have debt to GDP ratios in excess of 100. So they're heavily indebted. And if you look at what you need to do to really get into what they see to be a confrontational arms race with Russia, we won't be talking about 0.2 or 0.3% of GDP. We're talking about a doubling of the amount that we spend on defense and probably higher. And that is bound to have consequences elsewhere in the economies. If you're not, money spent on defense is not necessarily a bad thing to spend a proportion of your money on defense. But money spent on defense is not money that's spent on capital investment in your economies. So, it's bound to have a knock-on effect to follow on from the boomerang sanctions that we put on Russian oil and gas products in the first place, which is still producing significant economic damage in our country.
Over the last few days, there was a conference in Murmansk about the Arctic. And if you read what Putin had to say, it was really quite remarkable, inviting Western countries to be partners in Arctic exploration and trade and all of that. It's really remarkable, for me, amazingly magnanimous. I mean, considering what's going on in the moment, saying, look, this is one of the final frontiers on this planet. We should do it together. We should all do it in a secure way. And we might make some money in the process. I was astounded he would make that kind of statement, given the circumstances that we're witnessing right now.
Yeah. No, I think the sooner that European leaders can get over this self-imposed hurdle of not talking to Russia and not talking to Putin, the better. When people were asking me about sort of 3 months ago what Donald Trump had to bring to Putin, I said the thing he had to bring was a relationship. I look back to the end of the Cold War, and it was Margaret Thatcher, Gorbachev, and Reagan. And they talked, and they started to understand each other. And the fact that European leaders are somehow proud of not talking to Russia is sort of beyond belief. That those getting into those conversations and starting to understand each other. I think it was Lavrov who was saying that I think Blinken ignored him at some conference some time ago. I mean, even if you don't like people, at least talk to them, at least find out their position. Because if you don't understand their position, then it's going to make your situation much worse. If we had really worked hard to understand Russia's situation, then we would not have got into this situation in the first place. In war, the loser deserves to lose, and we deserve to lose this one.
Well, Steve, you've given an absolutely magisterial account. Let me just, in the few seconds that we've got left, throw this in, perhaps for a future discussion. They're talking about, as you know, increasing defense, doubling it essentially. The French military budget is, as I understand, about 45 billion a year. If you doubled it, that would take it up to, let's say, 90. Macron, when he came to power in 2017, the chief of the defense staff in France resigned back in 2017 because Macron was asking for a reduction of more than 700 million euros on the defense budget. Now he is pretending, and I underline pretending, that he's going to increase it by 40 billion, in other words, 40,000 million. He tried to reduce it by 700 million, and now he's saying he's going to introduce it to 40,000 million. That simply doesn't add up, and I think that in addition to all the other things you've mentioned, Steve, just shows the extent of the ideology and the lack of realism. Anyway, Steve, Jermy, it's been an absolute pleasure. Both Peter and I have learned a huge amount listening to you. Thank you very much indeed for giving us your time.
No, thank you both for the invitation. It's been my pleasure.
We'd be delighted to have you back again. Thank you very much indeed. All the best, and thanks to our viewers, and we look forward to seeing you all again same time next week. All the best. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.